All right.
Hi, everybody. So minutes. That's a friend of the program, and Shane also has his own YouTube channel that he started recently, discussing typology, different typology methods, things like that. And Shane, one of the reasons I invited Shane and wanted to talk to him about what we're going to talk about tonight is because he identifies as, or comes out as, however you want to put it, as an ISTJ, at least in MBTI terminology. And I want to talk about the movie that I talked about a couple of videos ago, Conclave, and how I think it's a very SJ movie. And I wanted to get SJ's perspective. So, with all that, welcome, Shane. I'll give you a couple of, or a minute or so to say hi, and maybe introduce yourself for those of you who might not be familiar with you.
All right. Yeah. My name's Shane Starr. And as our majestic INFJ said, I am an ISTJ. I was typed by Eric, typing with famous people, but I self test as an ISTJ anyway. And we thought it would be a good idea to talk about this movie Conclave because it's unique in the fact that it's a sort of SJ centered movie. And most films we see nowadays have SE lead heroes,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's interesting that a movie with an SJ theme and feel to it can be entertaining as well as informative, and um, a really interesting story too. A little bit of controversy as well, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to dig deeper into the mysteries of the church and as they relate to typology, and see if we can come up with any new conclusions about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should also mention, Shane, I believe you're Catholic, right? Practicing Catholic.
Well, and this is a good segue into the movie also, and this is
Mm-hmm.
why I have so much of a I'm not a cradle Catholic as
Mm-hmm.
they say. I believed in God ever since I was a little boy, as early as I can remember. I did go a couple of years to Catholic school, but I was never baptized. And then for most of my teen and adult years, I identified with God, but I didn't like the church. I didn't go to church. I was anti church. I was anti Catholic. I could tell you all the bad things about the Catholic Church. If you would have told me even 5 years ago you're going to be Catholic, I would have laughed at you. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't, I can't explain exactly how this happened, but there's a number of spiritual, historical, and just religious doctrine concepts that led me to the church. But if I could pull it all together into one thing, I tried Christianity on my own and I failed. And it's embarrassing, but I lived a life no different than any non-Christian, and I realized that in order to succeed, I needed something more, something greater, and I found that in the church, and that leads me to where I am now and why I can understand the struggles with. There's a line in Conclave where they said the Pope had his doubts, and he said about God, and he said no, never about God. He
Mm-hmm.
lost his faith in the church, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
that was me. Looking at all the bad things that have happened in the church and thinking, I believe in God. God, I love you. It's just all your friends I don't like, that
Right.
kind of thing. And then I realized, from the Old Testament, through incest and all kinds of horrible things, God works through brokenness, and God works, in Jesus' own family line. There's awful sinful events. And God obviously works through broken people. And in this movie, God works through the brokenness of people to get what I think was the correct result at the end of the movie. And I think coming back to on a personal level, I realized, the church is unique. The Catholic Church is unique in that faith in the church is part of the creed. Nowhere
Faith in the
else does it do
church,
that. Yeah,
in the
faith in the
institution
church.
itself. Yeah,
Faith
right.
that God works through the church, through all the brokenness. And, to be sure, I don't take it lightly. Again, I
Mhm.
was the church's biggest critic for decades. But I understand that, you know, God works through broken people and broken institutions as well. And just
Okay.
because it might be broken doesn't mean it's not the church. And so,
Yeah. Well, I think that's good. A good background that sort of opens up sort of some plate setting here, and and I know we're going to talk about the movie, but I do want to sort of set some of the background. Especially about what does it mean when we say SJs. I think you and I probably are coming from the same place, but there could be some people out there watching this video who are like, what are you talking about, SJs? So SJ is sort of a terminology or term of art that comes from the Keirsey model, his four temperaments, where he breaks down the MBTI personality types and puts them basically into four categories. It's kind of the same four categories that we've seen since the ancient Greeks, right? And it's the SJs, the SPs, the NTs, and the NFs, right? So for the SJs, ESTJ, ESFJ, ISFJ, ISTJ, anybody who's got an S and a J, they're going to have either a lead, judging function in their first or second slot, that's extroverted, right? And in the Keirsey model, he calls them the guardians, and does, I think, a really good job of describing how SJs are sort of, as a temperament, they're the glue of society. I think of them. They are the worker bees. They are the people who keep the trains running and the lights on. And very good at logistical skills, very dependable, very hardworking, um, and I would say tend to trust institutions. They tend to not only trust them, but they actually run them. Right? They form them and run them. And so I find it interesting that you came from a place. I mean, assuming you've been an ISTJ your whole life, which we probably could assume, you came from a place where you didn't really trust the institution, but you sort of trusted the message behind it, right? And it could be because maybe as an SJ, you put too much, like you expect too much out of an institution, right? Like, like I want to I want to put my trust in you so bad that any sort of shortcoming hits me in my introverted feeling parts. um so so I find that as an interesting sort of introduction. And so the other thing about the Keirsey model, and sort of throwing around the terms, SJs or NTs, I mean, I do it as sort of like a catch-all. We're talking about general archetypes here, but the archetypes extend more, outside of just individual personalities, right? So an SJ could, is clearly the individual personalities, but I also think of cultures and institutions as being SJ or SP or NT or NF, by by the way they're formed, what their mission is, who's sort of running the show. Different countries, to me, just sort of seeing more SJ or more SP. Italy seems very SP, and Japan seems very SJ. But that's just in my mind. It's just the archetypes that I have. And other people could disagree. And so, what I think is really interesting about the movie, and I think this is a way to sort of get into it, is it's really this exploration of SJ-ness, right? Where you've got four, pretty much main characters, and they're all cardinals in the Catholic Church. Just to give the story here, the Pope dies, and in the Catholic Church, that means you have to elect a new pope, and that means you have to have a conclave. And that's a very, very formal, ritualistic process that all the cardinals, from around the world get together and they vote on who they think should be the next pope. And it's important to note that they just keep voting until somebody gets enough votes to win. And I think you have to get something like 72, 74, something like that. And so it's very process oriented. And that's why I sort of wanted to get your take on it, on what was going on, how did it make you feel, watching these things sort of unfold, in front of you. Did you think, did you agree with it? Did you think they were taking pot shots? All that kind of stuff. But I guess my first question is, just to start it off lightly, so at the very beginning, you've got the Ray Fiennes character, and the Pope had just died, and he's trying to get to the church or the Vatican, I guess it would be, where the Pope is, because he's trying to get there before the guy dies. And as an SJ, did you think it was starting off as a horror movie because somebody was late? Somebody was, as an SJ, they were late for an appointment. How did that make you feel?
Um, well, just watching it wasn't even about the being late. It was his stress about it. You could hear him
Right.
breathing heavily and struggling to get his cap on, and it's because he cares about being on time,
Yeah.
and then quickly later on, the question comes up about him being notified of the Pope's death, and they have to give him a reason why he wasn't notified sooner. Another bit about time there. So right off the bat, we can see that there's this focus on punctuality or lack thereof that is it sort of underscores that this is going to be an SJ movie.
Right. And I'm sort of joking around, obviously, about, I mean, him being late, and it's just, terrifying. But to me, it sort of introduced that character, right? That, this guy clearly is, you know, uh, to me, it was just showing that this guy is clearly an SJ, right? He and one of the worst things that you could do to an SJ is make them late for something, for an important meeting. And I thought it was just sort of an interesting character and introduction to the character. So now, but let's talk about, there were a couple of things in the movie that, again, I think just sort of encapsulated the SJ mindset, and how it sort of, to me, I think of the Catholic Church as a very SJ institution, right? I mean, they are very rules based, very ritualistic, and a lot of, and I think of SJs as finding comfort in that, right? With the introverted sensing is not just about learning rules, but it's in remembering experiences, but it's also about your homeostasis, your comfort level, and I think there's something just attractive about the church and being an SJ, um, that that gives SJ that sort of level of comfort, because there's a system there. There's something that they can
Right.
rely on. What do you think? Do
Yeah,
you agree with that?
absolutely. To use an analogy, a lot of times when we see a dog go to its little kennel, and we think, why does he or she want to be in there? They're like trapped in a little cage, but that's where they feel comfortable. Um, that's sort of like the Catholic um, feeling about rules. They're not there to constrict us. They're a hedge around an uncertain, chaotic world. And the rules are there to help us and guide us and protect us. And I would say, even within the church, there will be more or less different characters. For instance, the Italian cardinal,
Hmm.
he provides us like a foil against the SH temperament. I think he's an ESTP. And you see how he's sort of loud,
Totally.
a little bit forward, very touchy, like putting his hand on people's shoulder. They're about to
Hmm.
walk away. No, wait, hold on, I'm not done yet. And he sits when everyone else is standing. So it's like, even though he's part of the whole rules culture, he kind of bends them around a little bit, and it helps us to see what good SJs look like even more, because you see the contrast with the sort of hardcore Italian cardinal.
Yeah, and I mean, and you mentioned it. I thought it was interesting that I agree. He was probably some sort of SP type character, or archetype, because he was sort of going against the rules, going against sort of polite society in a lot of ways. But his whole shtick, or his whole goal, was to bring the church back to its old ways, which I thought was interesting, right? So he was this bizarre sort of revolutionary that was trying to literally revolve it back to its original state. Um,
Right, but let me cut in real quick. And
yeah.
they if he wasn't good in that role, it wouldn't have made the movie as interesting, because even though
Hmm.
we may not agree with him politically, he brings up some great arguments.
Yeah.
Until Benita's speech at the end, I was in awe of his speech right before that. Towards the end of the movie.
Yeah.
There is an argument for that. Even if we don't agree with what he wanted to do, he brought up the language barriers, and he's like, before we used to all speak Latin. Now we're, the
Hmm.
English are over here, the French are over there, the Spanish speaking are over there. And you know, it wouldn't be as good of a movie if they had him to be some ridiculous, out there, weak character, because
Hmm.
there is an argument to be made for some of his opinions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And I did find myself at some point, sort of rooting for the guy. I mean, he was a charismatic type of, he was an SP, right? People like him. Yeah, and then obviously at the end he sort of goes overboard, but that was sort of to be expected. Um, so, but but it was also interesting to see the SJs around him just sort of you know fighting against the system it was a really interesting narrative or story dynamic where you had all these SJs who were trying to trust the system the whole time, right? And they were, do we trust this conclave system? Do we trust the church? Like you said, the Pope always, believed in God, but did he believe in the church? That kind of thing. And but they were fighting against somebody who wanted to make the institution even stronger, or I don't know, more conservative in some respects. So I thought that was a real interesting dynamic. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it came out, and it just shows how if you put personalities into the story, you get these interesting dynamics that come out of it, right? Whether it's
Absolutely.
intentional or not. So,
And
um,
I also real quickly wanted to bring up something I didn't catch as clearly the first time around, but when I watched the movie again, this morning, the role that the sister plays is
oh
very
yeah.
interesting, because then you have SJ against SJ. Ralph Fiennes wants to protect the institution and find out the truth so he can make the best informed decision. Meanwhile, she's protecting the institution against people breaking the rules and looking into things they're not supposed to have access to. And so you see one SJ's moral code against another SJ's moral code, and they both want the same thing, but I found that interplay really interesting. I
Right.
think that
Yeah.
nun was probably an ISTJ, but I'm
Probably.
not sure.
Probably. And again, she was protecting a system that, and there's a very strong undercurrent about how the Catholic Church treats women, right? Throughout the movie, um, and the role of women in the church, and she was sort of this representation of, trying to follow the rules, trying to do the right thing, trying to trust the institution. But she also knew that if she just kept her mouth shut, or if she didn't do anything, that, it would lead to the wrong result.
Right. Well,
In a
I mean,
moral FI perspective.
I think
Yeah.
if I was voting, I would have voted for Bellini,
Right.
the US guy. Plus, I like the actor. He's great in a
Yeah. So
number of
that's the Stanley
movies.
Tucci character, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He was good. Yeah, so he's I think he was the ISTJ. So there's the ISFJ, which is the Ray Fiennes character. He's the one that throughout the movie is sort of struggling with, do I trust this institution or not? Um, and the same could be said with the Stanley Tucci character. He was probably an ISFJ, ISTJ, and he was having the same doubts, right? He had sort of this forward-looking, a little bit more progressive view of the church. Giving women a larger role. Um, the church's stance against homosexuality, things like that, being maybe a little bit more tolerant, a little bit more inclusive than certainly the SP wanted. And then you had the ESTJ and the ESFJ, who are sort of the main cardinals, sort of battling it out, who are sort of the heir apparents. And like I said in my previous video, they had very interesting story arcs, because the ESFJ, he sort of gets in trouble for being too ESFJ, right? Spoiler, he had an affair early when he was very young, but still, when he was a young cardinal or maybe a young priest. But it was enough to where if it got out there, it would make, the church would just not be able to deal with the public
Right.
outcry. And
But
so,
just
go
in
ahead.
that scene, real quick, the attention to detail of an SJ, he's like, come on, we were young. He's like, no, she was 19, you were 30.
Yeah.
It's just like, bam, you can't get by SJs with the attention to detail. They won't let you have that, you
Right.
know. It's like, come on, we're just, that was a long time ago. No, she was this old, you were that old. This is how long ago it was. What about the child? It was just like,
Yeah.
it left him with nowhere to go. And then when he was telling him, there is no hope, just looked him straight in the eyes. There's no
Yeah.
hope for you to be Pope. And then um, I, I found it interesting because most of us don't have that good of FE.
Hmm.
Either
Well, he's
we're
the ISFP.
robots or we
Yeah.
don't have boundaries or we're just whatever. We don't know how to use it that well. And
Uh-huh.
somehow in that procedural environment, without necessarily telling everyone sort of knew what happened, and he lost all the votes on the next round.
Yeah. 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 And I thought that was another great sort of representation or illustration of with Rafe finds his character, where you could tell he really liked this guy. He really liked the ESFJ cardinal who got in trouble, and probably was rooting for him, to some degree. I don't think he would have been his first choice. We know he wasn't, because he wasn't voting for him. But I don't think that he would have minded if he had ultimately become the Pope. I think he really liked him, until all this came out. And I don't think he was even really judging him, on sort of a moral ground. It was more about, we have to protect the church. We have to do what's right for the church. and it's certainly not going to be somebody who had a child out of wedlock with a 19-year-old, right?
Right.
And you might be my best friend in the world, but we've got to put the church in what it represents, ahead of um, ahead of
Right.
ourselves, right?
And they
You know,
made reference to the sexual scandals in the church and why they couldn't
hmm
have that. Um, also,
hmm
um, yeah.
yeah, and that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so, what would I think the main point of, well, I mean, there's several different main points. The main point for everyone else is, the twist at the end of the movie. But
hmm
for me, from a typology standpoint, the most interesting part of the movie, the center homily or speech that Father Lawrence Fine's character makes is about, the biggest sin is certainty. We need to embrace
Oh yeah,
uncertainty. And that's an SJ talking about embracing their inferior NE. And I
yeah,
thought that's what the whole movie's about, being able to stay true to your SJ-ness, trust the institution, but let go and trust that God's working through that institution. And it's, life isn't always black and white like us SJs like it or want it to be. There
hmm
are a lot of shades of gray, and maybe that's the way God wants it.
right, right. I think yeah, that was a real. His speech raised a real interesting point where he says basically, without uncertainty there is no mystery, and with no mystery there's no faith. And what are we here for if you have no faith? And so if you're dead certain about everything, then you should be questioning that. And you and I had some email exchanges about that earlier, and I just
Right,
thought that was a real interesting point because it's so anti-SJ, but to
right.
your point, it's this fourth function that is sort of aspirational, right?
And if people are asking why would a religious person want to embrace doubt, isn't that the opposite? Because most people watching probably aren't even religious. So let me explain with a parable
Sure.
from the philosopher Kierkegaard, who
hmm
was a Lutheran himself, but he attacked the institution of Christianity a lot in his writings, and often called the first existentialist. He had a parable about a king and a maiden. A king fell in love with a maiden and wanted to marry her, but he couldn't show up as king because then, of course, he can just command her and she's scared of him. And then how does he know that she really loves him if he comes to her in all his glory? So what he did is he disguised himself as a peasant, worked alongside of her and worked for her love, and then he revealed himself to her after. And I
Princess
think
Bride, right?
it's a beautiful parable that illustrates, why would God work through brokenness? Why would God work through, you know, someone dying on the cross? Why could or should we trust the church? It's because if it was just right there in your face, there's no love. Really, ultimately, it's the church is all about love, and you can't have love under slavery. You have to have
hmm
free choice, and free choice necessitates that interplay between faith and doubt.
Yeah, yeah. I like that. And I think that helps sort of underscore Ray Fine's speech, and and just I don't know if it's necessarily paradoxical. It kind of seems paradoxical, right? That the only way to really love or trust the institution is to doubt it. But it's an interesting thought, and what I really thought was funny, really good filmmaking, I thought, was after his speech. As an audience member, you're watching it, and of course, they're just focused on Ray Fiennes, and you're really getting into it, and it's a very emotional take. And then as soon as he's done, they switched the shot back to a shot of all the Cardinals watching him from the audience, and they're all just deadpan, like they had no idea what he just said. Right? It's just all these SJs, and they're just like, "What? What are you talking about?" Which
Right.
I thought was funny, but ultimately, I think they had to learn that lesson. Um, so let's talk about another thing that I thought was interesting. That again just sort of rang SJ to me, where again so the Ray Fiennes character, he's talking to somebody, and honestly, I forget who exactly he was talking to, but he was talking to them about how he had a conversation with the previous pope, the pope that had just died. And in Ray Fiennes, he knew that he was sort of in the running, so to speak, to be the next pope, because he was a pretty high ranking cardinal, and I think like the right hand man or so of the pope. And so they had a candid conversation about whether the Ray Fiennes character was basically cut out to be the pope. And apparently he had expressed to the pope doubt, self-doubt, and et cetera, et cetera. And the pope apparently told him that, yeah, you're not really a shepherd, you're more of a guy who manages the shepherds, right? You're not really the pope, you're not the visionary, you're not the guy who's going to lead the church into the next 20, 30, 40 years, but you do an excellent job of managing the people, the pope and the cardinals and all of that, and that is ultimately probably your calling. um so again, as an SJ, what did you get out of that? Because it just seems so SJ to me, to tell somebody that.
Yes. Well, and I could look at this from a number of different perspectives. One is that SJs are good managers.
Hmm.
Not, depending on which SJ you are, you might not be as good a manager of people as you are of things. You
Hmm.
know, a really introverted person might manage numbers really well and be a great accountant, but not a leader of others, whereas,
Yeah, that's a good
you
point.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, but Ray Fiennes, obviously he embraced his role, but even he started having feelings that, well, maybe I need to step up and be more of a shepherd. But it's all part of that doubt interplay again. Um, it's really important, whatever your type is in life, to find what you're naturally good at and kind of go with that. We can work on things that we're
Hmm.
not as good at. The universe will always bring us back to where we kind of belong. Either through an opportunity or from failure. And I think in Ray Fiennes' place, when he started maybe getting at the tiniest aspirations about being Pope himself, things happened, most notably an explosion. But
Yeah.
things happened that kind of steered him back on track, back to that managerial role.
Yeah, I mean, it literally and figuratively, sort of blast him back into reality, so to speak. Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting point. I didn't think of that. Um, yeah. So, and so I guess one other thing, and maybe I mean, well, I don't want to say it's the last thing, but it's sort of the capstone, I think, of sort of the structure of the story. Is again, you have these SJs sort of battling it out. You have the ESTJ, and again, he sort of gets in trouble because he gets too ESTJ, right? He tries to do this scheming and get the other guy in trouble, and put the news out there about the other guy's child that he had out of wedlock. And
Yeah.
but they obviously don't take kind to that, like that was a pretty shitty thing to do. And again, he sort of hoists himself on his own petard, right? Because that's his extroverted thinking and his scheming, right? And so again, it's sort of this Greek mythology of whatever your power is or whatever your strength is, ultimately ends up being your downfall, right? Like
Right.
Walter White is too smart for his own good, kind of thing. So this guy is a little too scheming, for his own good.
Yeah,
And,
very dislikable character. One of my
mm-hmm.
favorite lines in the movie was when Adeyemi called him Judas traitor at the end, because
Mm-hmm.
right up till the end he was trying to manipulate the others. But yeah, John Lithgow's character's the most despicable out of the whole movie, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really didn't like him. One thing I did want to touch on before we end is, the big thing of the movie, why many religious people say, oh, you shouldn't watch this movie because it's, bad or something, is the ending. What ends up being, the ending. And I think we might benefit ourselves and anyone in the audience by discussing that a little bit.
Yeah. So the character, the character at the reveal about the character at the ending. Yeah, that's sort of what I was getting at about the capstone of it. But I wanted to touch on the ESTJ thing real quick. But yeah, I think a couple of things. I mean, well, so first of all, taking a step back, so we have this other character which we haven't talked about yet on this this stream, but I talk about it in the other one, in my earlier one. And he is a cardinal that comes out of nowhere, right? Where nobody even knew that this guy existed, but apparently he had just recently been named cardinal in Afghanistan and had been, a bishop, or sort of rose through the ranks in very unknown territory. So he was this very unknown sort of guy, and he gets introduced, and immediately, if you've ever seen a movie before, you're just like, okay, we know what this is we know what this guy's gonna be. But he's sort of in the background. And what I thought was interesting is, again, going to the SJ-ness of it all. So the first 10 to 15 minutes of the movie, the Pope had died, and they had to do all this stuff to get ready for the next conclave, right? They had to get all the cardinals in, they had to prepare all the rooms, they had to prepare all the meals, they had to prepare the dinner, and so, and there's this whole thing with the Pope's ring that they had to do, but it was very process, very TETE. We got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this. And especially if somebody who's TE polar, you're just like on the edge of your seat, like, oh my god. But the music was very sporadic, and it was just like one thing after another. And then they introduced this character, and they introduced him very sort of procedurally, like, oh, who's this guy? We got to set up, we got to figure out who he is, and get him a meal or a seat at the table, that kind of thing. It was all about getting him into the process. And so then they're introducing him, and they ask him, as sort of the new guy in town, do you want to say the blessing for the meal? And he says a few words, and then everybody just starts eating or getting ready to eat, because they're so in TE mode, they're so in SJ process mode. And then the guy starts going on about bless these people, thank you for these people, thank you for these people. And for the first time in the movie, about 10, 15 minutes in, you finally get somebody who's acting, quote unquote, Christ like, right? Somebody who's actually like, this is what we're here for, people. It's not
Right.
just this, process, which is important, but ultimately, let's take a step back and remember why we're here. And it's, and you just sort of see it on everybody's face as everybody just sort of remembers, like, oh yeah, right. We're actually supposed to reflect on this stuff. Um, so he ends up being obviously an interesting character, because he's not against the process. He trusts the process. He tells Ray Fiennes repeatedly, like, I trust you. Not only that, but he's voting for him. Um, Things like that. but ultimately, this is the INFP, sort of Christ character that comes out of nowhere. Everybody starts backing him, right? So I'll leave it at that and let you sort of give your thoughts on him and what he sort of meant to the story. And also, just sort of your SJ take. Like, I mean, he clearly wasn't an SJ. And so how do you
Right.
take that as the guy
Well,
who sort of ultimately wins is not the SJ?
you
Right?
know,
Or,
to be really, what are we all in typology for? It's to understand ourselves, and when we do understand ourselves, that involves a true hard look at our weak points. And I think this character, Benitez, the INFP, I think he shows, with high NE exactly what all our SJs are missing in their lives.
mm-hmm,
And they do that in a crafty way. It's not to cast shade on SJs. It just shows like, look, you get so locked into your procedures and ABCD, TE stuff that you forget the meaning of it all. And that was really telling to me because in my own life it's like robotic. Wake up every morning, do a certain exercise, do a workout, drive to work, get my desk a certain way, do all my work, come home, go to bed, wake up, do it again. Next thing you know, a week, months gone by, couple years. Next thing like the Pink Floyd song says, 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the start. And
right.
that's something that all of us in SJ land run the risk of doing. We get so locked in, whether it's counting steps on our phones. We forget the whole purpose behind it. You're doing that to do something else, not see how many steps you can get. This process. The ISTJ, my favorite in the movie. Ray Fiennes has to tell him it's not a war, and he's all, no, it is a war. And he's
Mm-hmm.
so blind. I thought,
It's that
gosh,
it's
that's
that
like
third
me,
function. It's that
completely
third slot
blind.
FI, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so Benitez really, I mean, you have to root for the guy, and
Uh-huh.
um, when when he says, also he talks about, he goes straight at the SJ notion of protocol, procedure, and tradition. He says the church isn't about this conference with the power. It's not about tradition, what it's been in the past. The church is what we do next. And it was like, wow, man, I was like in awe of that. It was like, he's right. The
Mhm.
church itself, if you believe in God, if you're Catholic and believe in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, you believe that God, the Holy Spirit, works within that. The church is a living entity. It's what we do next. And that just put the um the Bellini guy, that just like put the nail in his coffin as Pope. There's no way he was going to win it after that speech.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's almost making me doubt his SJ-ness, right? Or he at least sort of he let his third function FI, I think, take over, because or ISTJs, they have that third function FI that could make
All right.
them real true believers, right, in their cause.
All right.
Um,
You know what? I misspoke. I was
mhm.
thinking of the Italian guy.
Oh right, oh yeah, yeah.
Who
He certainly fell off the
he
yeah,
after
yeah,
that speech, he was done.
yeah.
Both of those guys were done after that speech. I mean,
I
it was
yeah, right. So they were when they were talking to each other. Gotcha. Right.
right.
And yeah, I mean, clearly the SP guy, everybody was like, okay, this, he was sort of this shadow of Mussolini almost, right? Um,
Yeah.
so you got a little scared of
Maybe he
him.
was ESFP, huh? Didn't you say he's an ESFP instead of TP?
I don't know. I just kind of thought he was an SP.
Yeah,
Sort
he's
of
one of
extroverted
those.
SP. Yeah. I mean, I don't think we get enough of him.
Yeah.
the
Definitely
classic
an
case of like
extrovert.
he's there to serve a particular role, and
Right.
they don't really do that deep of a dive, but it's enough to be like, okay, that's the SP that's sort of throwing his weight around, very Donald Trump like, walks in the
Very.
room and everybody has to get out of his way kind of
Right.
guy.
Right.
Um,
Exactly the opposite of Benitez, who ends up winning. And
yeah,
back to Benitez in the uncertainty. I really liked the part that his gender really was an uncertainty. He said, "There's
yes,
nothing different about me, on the outside," which tells you he's got the body parts, without saying as such.
yeah,
So, I liked that they didn't make the movie too radical in the sense where, like, he was a woman masquerading as a man or something,
right. I
that would
was
have
a little
been, to
nervous. I got
me,
to be honest. I was like,
the,
oh no, don't go
the,
there.
the criticism of the movie would have been more applicable had that been the case.
Yeah,
Instead, it was like, here, this is a guy who identifies as a guy. And he looks mostly like a guy. He has the parts. It's like, oh, inside he has this other thing. It's like, and you notice Ray Fiennes even had his doubts after. He's just sitting there, and then he sees the turtle. It's almost like the Pope, the sign of the last Pope, telling him, "Hey, this was the process. Everything's okay."
yeah,
And
yeah. And it was
then he
ultimately,
accepts it.
and I think it's interesting to point out that, the whole reason it came out was this guy was scheduled to go to a clinic to, yeah, I think he had like, I think he was like outwardly male, but had like a uterus or something. I
Yeah.
don't know exactly what the details are, but it was something to where, he had some sort of female physiology and he was going to go to get that fixed, right? And the Pope knew about it, and the Pope like
Right.
basically sent him to this clinic so that he could quote unquote get it fixed. But then he realized the priest or cardinal realized, well, this is the way God made me, and and is it really my place to doubt, you know, the way that God made me, right? So
Right.
even though
Embrace
it
the
goes back to
uncertainty.
embrace the uncertainty, exactly. It goes into that whole theme of the balance between uncertainty and then trusting the system. And if you think of the system as God, trusting God.
And
Uh,
then note how nicely that all came together. He said, maybe this is what will help me make a difference.
yeah.
And given the political climate in the movie, people, cars blowing up outside the conclave and radicals wanting to take the church back to its former stance, um, you know, what the others were worried about, everyone, it worked out. Like, the process did work out. You can
Hmm.
have faith. It just didn't happen the way you would expect it to,
Right.
but it did work out in the
Yeah. And
movie.
if and if you're the poor ESTJ trying to scheme, and plot behind the scenes, you're going to get called out, right? You can't control the system
Because
in
no
that
man
way.
is an island. And
Right.
coming back full circle to my um, little monologue at the beginning of our time together,
Hmm.
that's what I learned. You know, the system is there to help us. Actually,
Hmm.
systems aren't evil. People are.
Yeah.
And it blaming everything on the system's just another euphemism almost to instead of calling out bad people behind it. I
Hmm.
think
Which I'll put a footnote is a very SJ, view of the world, but I can't say it's wrong. It's just, it fits very well into the SJ temperament, right? You are the guardian of the institution and of the culture. So go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
right. No, I was just gonna say, and again, to echo what Benita said, the church is what we do next. It's not just something written in stone. That it's dynamic. It changes. That's why there was a back when to go back to that the Italian bishop wanted to go back to, because the church has changed since then, and it will continue to change. you know
Mm-hmm.
um and that's nothing new. When people say, well, how's that God then? Does God change his mind? No, it's things happen in the fullness of time. The God you see in Exodus isn't the one necessarily who sacrifices his life on the cross. It's different revelations at different times, and maybe the world will be ready for some of these changes, in the fullness of time again, but it's not going to happen overnight, not with some sweeping new edict or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Just like people grow and change, maybe the institutions that are made of people grow and change. But the point you've been making throughout is that's a very NE, sort of approach to things, which again is sort of embracing that fourth function and realizing that it's not all, set in stone, but, there might be, you have to find the balance, right? You can't be too radical.
Right.
Obviously, or then you don't have an institution at all. And of course, this is the big debate, legal scholars have about the Constitution and whether it's a living document or we're supposed to just
Well,
be, Scalia originalists and just go with what they thought in
right.
the 1700s,
Now, I'm biased, obviously, given my own typing, but I'd rather have an SI foundation and work on my NE than
Hmm.
be an unhinged postmodernist, anything goes without any
Did
structure
you
or
did you see my video on how
organization.
all the ENFPs ruined art in?
Yes. And I think that really hit the nail on the head. And
Yeah,
I mean, it
yeah.
was so
There are
good.
no rules, man. Yeah.
When you do that, it cannibalizes itself, because then your own opinion that there's no rules, or your own opinion subject to the same kind of deconstruction that you're applying to everyone else's notions of value. So
Right.
if everything's relative, why should we believe your assertion that everything's relative? It's kind of like a
Yeah, yeah.
downward
Like you
spiral.
you can't say that there is no truth when
So
when you're trying to declare a truth.
So
Yeah.
this movie, back to the movie, it
Hmm.
is a nice SI foundation of stretching into that inferior NE and exploring it a little bit. And it's scary, and we doubt, but that's what growth for an SI looks like. And
Yeah.
that's what it looks like in an institution, as we saw in the movie. And that's what it looks like personally, like even, if it's me having to adjust to changes at work or a change in routine, it doesn't come easy, but growth is painful sometimes, and all the time, really. And
Hmm.
that's a beautiful lesson to learn in life. That probably the same with you being lead NI. You could probably think of a story where you could tap into your inferior SE and think, how can I grow and
Hmm.
get into this without doing it in an unhealthy way?
Yeah.
you know don't go overboard into it, but just little by little stretch that inferior muscle and make it stronger.
Yeah. 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 And I'm, as I've said in previous videos, I'm not huge on. I know a lot of people see the MBTI and cognitive functions and all that as sort of this, work on your shadow functions as sort of self-help guru type stuff. I do like, I think what you're saying agrees with this. The approach of, hey, just trust what you got and learn to appreciate what you got. And then realize that, every once in a while you're going to have to tap into something that's a little bit outside of your comfort zone. But you don't have to live there. You could
Absolutely.
go back to your comfort zone, but to be sort of a well-rounded person, you gotta sometimes push yourself. But that doesn't necessarily mean if you're an INFJ, you got to go skydiving every weekend just to push those
No,
SE
no.
muscles, right?
To,
And
to use another analogy, it's like having a sandbox, whether you're inferior SE or NE, you have your sandbox and it's bordered by NI or SI
mhm,
concepts or principles. And then inside that sandbox, that's where you can kind of play and do whatever you want, but it stays in between the structure. You don't get sand outside of the
yeah,
lines, you know? So it's like
y-
it still has a foundation around it that the lead NEs or SEs lack
yeah.
because they don't have fences. It just goes, you know?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think of it, my analogy, I think that's a good analogy. My analogy, especially when it comes to the polar function, not so much the fourth function, but the polar function. So with me, it would be extroverted thinking. With you, it'd be extroverted feeling. Is that it's sort of like being left-handed, right? So I play a couple of music instruments like piano and guitar and drums, and so there's a certain amount of things I could do with my left hand, right? But and it's the same way with TE. Like there's a certain amount of things I could do, and I'm okay with using my TE, but I don't use my left hand to do everything, and I don't, and I certainly don't, try a bunch of new things, on the spot with my left hand in the same way that I don't try a lot of new things with TE. Um, but there are things that I do. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I got to do TE stuff every day, almost 90% of the time, and so I've trained myself. Okay, this is the way I do this TE stuff, right? And as long as I can say, in your analogy, in that sandbox, then I'm perfectly comfortable, right? But if somebody comes and says, "Okay, we're changing the system," then it's going to take me a while to readjust.
Right.
So yeah. So
So
go ahead.
my my question to you in closing,
Hmm.
in for the movie Conclave, what would be your NI theme for the movie? What do you think the general public can learn from this film? What do you
Oh,
think people can learn about it?
you know, I I really liked. It's very rare to see a movie about religion without it bagging on the religion, right? Usually when you have some sort of religious character or some sort of religious institution, there's, it's they're either rotten to the core or there's somebody behind the scenes making it rotten, right? But very rarely, do you have a movie or a story where the theme is it's okay to trust it. It's okay to put your trust in it because whether you think of it as God's hand, sort of guiding the process, or it's just an institution that's evolved over thousands of years with very smart people, sort of picking and choosing what the rules should be. And this rule seems to work and this rule doesn't really work, so we'll keep this one and get rid of that one. Um, Either way that you look at it, I thought it did a good job of saying, hey, look, we're not perfect, right? They acknowledge the scandals. They acknowledge the role of women in the church's view on homosexuality, other things that are sort of controversial to the church. So they didn't sweep it under the rug and try to make this thing, the church look, completely pristine and perfect, but they also gave it its due, right? These are it's made of its people, and there are some flawed people, some more than others, and there's some very good people, but ultimately you have to trust the system. And in a lot of ways that's sort of trusting each other, right? Because the system is the people, right? and
Right.
and, and and so they have to trust each other. And I raised this in my earlier video about Malcolm Gladwell's sort of taxonomy or breakdown of different types of stories. And he would consider this, sort of a northern, quote unquote, where there's a system that is, ultimately, I mean, he put it as it's flawless. I wouldn't say it's flawless, but you could trust it, right? In the end, it's going to come out with the right answer. Um, and that's sort of, your Law and Order type of shows, your police procedurals, where you just sort of trust the system is going to come out with the right answer by the end of the hour, right? And here it was sort of the same thing. And I thought that from an NI perspective, I thought that was very rare, right? To me, it was a relief to see. I thought, it was very mature in the way that it handled very difficult subject matter, right? Without pointing fingers, without being, you know, overly judgmental or being, too far on one side or the other, right? Either being too conservative about it, that everything's great, it's all sunshine and rainbows, just trust in Jesus, versus, maybe a more, super woke, everything's wrong. We got to destroy the system from within. It caught that nice balance, I thought,
Right.
with a really good message. Um, but but that being said, I think the SJs probably are just get more out of it than probably a lot of other types might, because it really is, to me, is sort of ode to SJ-ness, trusting the system and doing what you,
Right. But
yeah.
I think from an SI perspective, like from a typology SI perspective, again, for me, the theme was learning what growth looks like and
Hmm.
knowing like you can have structure and organization and procedure and protocol, but there is room within that for growth. And this is what
Yeah.
growth looks like is, fresh reminders, variety, embracing uncertainty, difference, and learning to be okay with that unsettledness or discomfort. And that's how we grow. That's
Hmm.
how we grow in an institution and as individuals. And so
Right.
that's what the movie did for me.
Yeah.
And I really liked it. And
Yeah.
I'm happy that you turned me on to it because I had heard about it and I thought I'll watch it someday. I heard so
Yeah.
much like
Right.
controversy about it, and it's like I kind
Oh,
of
I
knew the
hadn't even heard there
story.
was controversy, but I mean, I'm sure there is. I just
Yeah,
hadn't
there's a
seen
lot
it.
of
Yeah.
YouTube people saying don't watch it. It's anti-Catholic or anti-religion. I didn't
Oh,
get
really?
any of that
I
at
didn't.
all.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, they clearly, they don't sweep things under the rug, right? And I could see somebody who is just diehard, the church can do no wrong. But I thought they handled it very maturely without, being
Absolutely.
for lack of a better term, preachy about it. Um, so, but I get it. There's probably some very hardcore ESTJs that are any polar, and they're just like, no, we don't like this at all. And I
Yeah.
get it.
You know what?
Uh,
It's funny you mentioned that. One of my best friends is an ESTJ, and that's why
uh-huh.
by comparing myself to him, that's why I know at least in MBTI terms I'm not one. Because we have a lot overlap, but you cannot change this guy's mind about anything. It's
Yeah,
so
yeah,
weird how stubborn that type of those people are. Oftentimes they're right. Okay, don't
yeah,
get me wrong, but
right.
it's just like you can't even let him see a different perspective. He doesn't. It's like even if he's wrong, it's like don't bother me with the facts. My mind's already made up. Like
Yeah.
literally, that's how he is. Like and so he's a Christian, anti-Catholic. He would hate the movie though.
Okay. Yeah.
He would see it as an abomination and stuff. But and there's no changing his mind, like
Right.
no open-minded. I wonder if that's because FI's on bottom. Is that why they're like that? I don't
I,
know. I just it's
I,
something
to
with that
me,
type
to me, it seems more, more, and I said unipolar, I meant anipolar.
and I
Uh,
polar. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, to me, when there's a real like deep seated, like this person just digs in their heels, whether it's, an SJ saying, these are the rules and I refuse to do things differently,
Mhm.
or an NF who are just like, this is my moral code and I refuse to, acknowledge any exceptions, to my moral code. When people dig their heels in, it's in my mind, it's because of their polar function. And I think and I've got a couple of videos out there where I talk about ESTJs and ESFJs, where they're the type of people where, if they're running an ancient village and they sacrifice virgins and pray to the gods for their food, and then they have a drought, and the food stops growing. They instead of trying to figure out, hey, let's do something new here. Let's try something else. Let's pick up and move or something. They just double down on what
Yeah,
always worked, right? And they'll just say, okay, let's sacrifice twice as many virgins
yeah,
and pray twice as hard.
exactly.
And and when I work with a lot of ESFJs. Obviously law firms are sort of notoriously run by either ESTJs, usually ESTJs. A lot of businesses are. And then when you have sort of an economic downturn, or something is going, sort of a downturn in the business, they always double down on what's always worked, right? They're just like, well, we just need to come into the office more, right? Or we need to, make more, make twice as many phone calls before lunch, that kind of thing, rather
Right.
than stepping back and saying, okay, what's really the problem here? Because they don't have that NI perspective of let's figure out what's really going on here. And so with your friend, yeah, I don't really know the details, but I can imagine he likes to dig his heels in because he's not seeing the NI part of it, and he's only seeing what he's experienced, right?
Right.
And so what I found, when you're dealing with the ESFJ or ESTJ, is you have to show them data from from a similar business or a similar situation where somebody else did what you're saying to do, what you're recommending, right? And their profits doubled, right? Or something like that. They have to see that somebody else did it, right?
Right.
Somebody else did what you're this new way
But
of doing things.
even then, it'll take them time. They're not
Oh
going to
yeah,
just,
yeah.
even after
Yeah.
seeing it.
They don't, yeah, I mean, they're the classic, let's not get outside of the herd. The first one outside of the herd is the one that gets hunted, and blah 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 blah. But so they definitely have that mentality. But to your point, they're usually right. A lot of times there is a reason to trust the system. There is a reason to trust this institution that's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of
I mean,
years. And
the
and
thing
having the
is,
INFJ tell you do something completely different, you're kind of like, yeah, really? Should I?
and, no system's perfect, and
Mhm,
some are worse than others. But what's the alternative? I've
mhm.
tried doing it on my own, and some people are great at that. I see we have Power Red Bull typology in the comments
Oh,
there.
okay. What's up?
They are that's an INTP person.
Oh
People
yeah.
like that are very independent,
Hmm.
start their own business type, and I'm
If they can
just
get over that
not
SE hump.
one of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. And I mean, I'm the same way. I like to think of myself as entrepreneurial and that I could just at any moment just start my own business. But then I realized, like, oh, I have this whole institution backing me, that it receives my mail and it sets up my IT, and I don't have to worry about setting up a new
and you get
phone
a
number.
paycheck.
Yeah, exactly. The money just appears in my bank account.
You know,
Um,
and
and,
those
and
people
you're just
always
like, I don't
say,
want to do all that crap.
"Yeah,"
So,
and it's just running your own business is just super
Yeah.
scary to me. Even, you know,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I mean, I could imagine an SJ and ISTJ, working for the ESTP entrepreneur, as long as they trusted them that they're actually going to get their paycheck. But yeah, that's often a dynamic I see in clients. Because I have a lot of startup clients or clients that have been around for a long time, and the person running it is usually an ESTP, entrepreneurial type, or maybe an ESTJ that inherited it, that kind of thing. um, but they always have an ISTJ like running the thing, running the shop behind the scenes.
mhm,
um, God
yeah.
bless the ISTJs. And if it's not an ISTJ, it's an ISFJ. Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
Uh,
they do the same thing. I don't know if the people who commented are still here, but if anyone had any questions, I'd be happy to go
yeah,
down
we
that
got a
road.
couple of trolley type comments, so
Yeah, I
I
saw
deleted
that.
them. And I have no
Good.
idea who those people were. I don't
I
know if we're
didn't either.
reaching a broader audience because we're doing this dual live or whatever, but yeah. But yeah, if anybody wants to leave a comment, I'm sure, I'm happy to follow up. I'm sure you're happy to follow up. Um,
Absolutely.
your videos seem to be a little bit more structured and planned, but you know, um, if anybody has questions, certainly let us know, and we can always follow up as well together. So, but
I
this has
I
been
would
great.
I
I
would
know
love
I've
to
gone
do
over the
this
hour.
again.
Yeah,
I, like we'll have to think of something else. Like next time we'll do something not about religion, everyone. So don't
yeah,
worry.
yeah. I think
um
that's why we were getting the snarky comments, because God forbid
nobody
you
likes
talk about the Catholic Church in a positive way.
yeah, God
But
forbid.
but yeah, no, I'd be happy to. And if anybody out there, wants to get the SJ and NF take on things, let me know. Because I've mentioned in the past, there's a channel, NF Geeks, that I really liked, and the guy who hosted it, Mike, he would have different people from different typologies, Kiersey type temperaments on, and he was where I got that whole like SJ versus NF versus NT kind of, you know, um, sort of outlook on things. Um, and I really liked, when he would talk to an NT, like an NF talking to an NT or an NF talking to an SJ, because in my mind, as you're learning this stuff and if you're new to it, you see the compare and contrast, right? You see the way that I
Right.
talk versus the way you talk, and what the stuff that I might raise versus the stuff you raise. And even
Mm,
though we might be thinking of the same thing and we might agree on it, we come from it, at it from sort of different angles, which I think is interesting.
right.
So I
Um
appreciate you coming on.
I I like this question we got about what do we perceive to be our biggest differences. I've been inspired by your channel ever since I started watching it. And what I like is I can't think of any differences right offhand, but I would say this is that there are a lot of similarities. We both just do the regular basic recording without hardly any graphics or anything like that. We just talk. I'd say the difference is funny to come back to the movie, but I think you, Majestic INFJ, you trust the process more, whereas
Really?
I I
Okay.
want to I have anxiety about the process. So that's why my videos are more structured because I don't know what's going to happen if I just get up there and start talking. Like I
Oh,
need to like, so that would be one difference we have. But
yeah.
it's
Well, I
cool
mean,
because we're compared to all the other people out there, I think we're pretty similar. I don't
yeah,
know anyone's channel that's as similar to mine as yours and
yeah,
vice versa.
yeah. I mean, some of it might just be, we're busy. We have jobs, and
Yeah,
we can't sit
that makes
around.
us unique.
Yeah. I mean, we right in today's economy. But we don't have time to sit around and make really intricately designed videos because this is not our job, right?
Right.
As opposed to somebody like meet Kristen, or you know some of the other, or even like Michael Pierce or something, that put these really well crafted videos together. But to them, I think they kind of saw that as their job, or or they had the time to do it. So I think that's part of it. I don't know if it's necessarily personality. um and, and but yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, you'll have notes, and I can tell you have sort of, a list of things that you want to get through in your video. It's usually more of sort of, there's more of a consistent theme, like, here's the 16 types in church, and here's the 16 types, at work or whatever, which I love those types of things, and every once in a while I'll do something like that. Um, but again, my motivation has been, both Eric and Mike, and just sort of just blabbing, just sort of free forming and saying whatever comes to mind, with maybe the mistaken assumption that some people will get something out of it. Um, I'll have a theme and a few points that I want to make. But again, like some people have pointed out, it's very NE dump kind of material. um but that's just our videos. I mean, I think as far as our personalities, I mean, I have to find my inner SJ to do my job, and so I have an appreciation for SJs. I love SJs. I could not do my job without SJs. And I have an appreciation for them. But when I come home, it's like I have to just completely un SJ myself, right? Which I'm assuming you probably don't do.
No, I'm robotic SJ at home. You can see everything's just
Hmm.
exactly placed, like
Yeah.
very, you know, structured, and just all I need is right there. And I know, the drawers are all organized, everything. Um, Back to the differences in our videos. I would say that yours are a little more intellectual than mine for sure. Not just a little bit, much more. Some of the topics you talk about, I can follow them, but that's sort of like the difference between understanding a language and being able to speak it. I
Yeah.
can follow your videos, but when you're talking about, I'm looking at this next comment. You're you can dive deep into those topics that I'm interested in, but I don't feel comfortable or confident in making those videos. And then
Mhm.
that's funny. I'm contained, serious. It's 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 funny. I guess I'll take that as a compliment, kind of like I've had stints in my life, much like an NI lead who overdid SE for a while. I've
Yeah.
had times in my life where I overdid the NE and it got me into trouble.
Uh-huh.
Um, but yeah, there was another question about would we want this to be our jobs. I think both of us would say no to that. This is like that's a definition of a hobby. And
Yeah.
I I would feel weird trying to do this for a living.
Yeah. I mean, because then you're just putting too much on it, right? It's what you learn in Psych 101. There's a difference between intrinsic value and extrinsic value, right? And when you do something for intrinsic value, like learn to play the guitar, or, learn a new language, or learn how to bake. Why? Because you like it and you like spending your time doing it, and it's cool and it's interesting and you can meet interesting people doing it. you get intrinsic value. But as soon as you say, "Oh, I love baking, so I'm going to start selling brownies or whatever, and that's going to be my job," now it's about the extrinsic value, right? And and there's all kinds of psychological research out there that as soon as you make that switch, you stop liking what you're doing. So I think
And that's very true.
yeah,
It's very true.
and 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 when I hear people say, do it, try to find a job where you're never, you never work a day of your life because you love what you do and it's your passion. Fine, there's maybe 5% of the population out there that can do that, that does do that, but the vast majority, it's like as soon
uh,
as you make that switch to extrinsic value, you stop
you know,
liking what you do. Yeah.
didn't Shakespeare said if every day were sport, then sport would be work, right?
Right, exactly.
And
Yeah.
that's very true.
Yeah.
I've
It's a
learned that.
yeah, I mean, if somebody wants to give me $1 million to make a video, I'm not going to turn it down, but I'm certainly not going to make it my job, because and I think the ISTJ in you will appreciate this, but I do think that there is um a benefit of having a real office, 9 to 5 type of job. I think it's healthy. I think it makes you just sort of psychologically all around better, rather than trying to chase,
Surrounded.
and then when you pick up a good book or watch a good movie or go and have a good meal somewhere, you almost appreciate it a little bit more,
Um,
because
absolutely.
yeah,
My oldest son makes more money than me doing like loans and tax help and stuff.
uh-huh,
And he's like, you need to go out and get what you're worth. And, and he's an ENTP. He's just tons of ideas. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to conquer the world. And, um, I just can't get myself out there and I don't want to.
right.
I don't want to make 100 phone calls a day and try to get someone to buy something. Like
Yeah.
that's not me. Give me final account statements and helping solve people's basic problems, like they're locked out of their house or
Uh-huh.
they need to renew their lease or something. Like I can handle that, and I'm helping other people, and it's a simple life, but it's I work for a big company and they're successful, and I know I'm not going to get laid off, and
Yeah.
that's enough for me. I don't want to. They say, oh well, there's no ceiling to how much you can make. Yeah, there's no floor either. So you might make $14,000 in one month and then make $200 the next month when some weird thing happens to the market or your company gets in trouble. I'm not really interested in that.
Yeah, it's the black swan, backtail phenomenon, right? Where yes, on average, you could do really well, but the one thing, that less than 2% chance thing that happens completely wipes you out,
Yeah,
um,
and then
and
taxes and stuff, you have to like
yeah,
be good enough to save money every month.
right.
People aren't going to do that.
And I remember, back when Trump was a business guy, and he it wasn't Art of the Deal, but it was one of his other books that I read. And he starts off talking about how he had just gone through bankruptcy. He had pretty much lost, his casinos and everything. And he's walking down the street of Manhattan and walks by a homeless guy, who theoretically is worth $0, let's say, but on paper. And but Trump is like, that guy is worth $900,000 more than I am, because Trump was in $900,000 in debt. Now because he was Trump, he was able to get himself
Right.
out of it. But I cannot imagine, that sort of ESTP kind of mindset of like, oh well, you just have to do this now.
You know, I've always been jealous of those guys. Like
Yeah.
even, my former life as a professional surfer, I had to have everything exactly right. My board had to match my wetsuit. The wax had to be perfect. The leash, everything. And these ESTP and ESFP guys, they'd have duct tape on their board. They were just having a good time. I'm just going to go out and rip and if it's big, that's okay. If it's small, that's okay. Here I am, all perfect. And it's like, oh, we're changing venues because the waves are better down the coast. And it's like, even if it is better, I had everything set up for right here in this little. Now you've messed up my whole life, and that's why I wasn't very adaptable, And
Yeah.
so back to what you were saying again, and back to the movie is learning. You know who you are, and you're not going to change. I'll never be the spontaneous duct tape on my surfboard. Let's just go, man, skydive or whatever.
Right.
But if I can stretch into that just a little and get myself a little less rigid, a little less, robotic with my routines, then I'll have a more healthy life.
Yeah, or at least a good story to tell, right?
Right.
Where people are like, "You did what?" But okay, well, very cool. Well, we're running up to 9:30.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you. I know you. I don't want to keep an
Yeah.
ISTJ off his schedule. So happy to wrap it up here, but
Yeah.
we should do this again. I like the idea of personality in the workplace. I got plenty to say about that, and I'm sure you do too. So yeah, we could talk offline and figure out what to do next. But I really
All right.
appreciate you taking the time and your thoughts,
Absolutely. Likewise.
and hopefully I didn't talk
And
over you too much.
for Power Red Bull typology, I'll answer and comment on some of those questions and comments later in the comments. All right.
Cool.
Anyway, hey, thanks.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
guess we'll end it here. Peace out.
All right. Now I got to figure out how to turn this thing off. All right. See you guys.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.